Hi.
Hello again. Chapter 34 of Genesis has been an absolute disaster for Jacob and his family. And he fears the worst coming out of chapter 34. He fears not only that the neighbors are going to hear about this and think the worst, but maybe come after them. And of course, they're his tiny family of young men and daughters. So what's going to happen? So it's interesting what does happen in the next chapter 35. God said to Jacob, so God is still talking to Jacob after this disaster, arise, go up to Bethel. Isn't that what he'd said to do before 34? Yeah. Go up to Bethel and dwell there. Make an altar there to the God who appeared to you when you fled from your brother Esau. So the altar there is stressed, right? Because he's just built an altar in Shechem. So Jacob said to his household and to all who were with him, put away the foreign gods that are among you, and purify yourselves, and change your garments. Then let us arise and go up to Bethel, so that I may make there an altar to the God who answers me in the day of my distress, and has been with me wherever I have gone. So they gave to Jacob all the foreign gods that they had, and the rings that were in their ears. Jacob hid them under the terebinth tree that was near Shechem. And as they journeyed, a terror from God fell upon the cities that were around them, so that they did not pursue the sons of Jacob. And Jacob came to Luz, that is Bethel, which is in the land of Canaan, he and all the people who were with him. And there he built an altar and called the place El Bethel, because there God had revealed himself to him when he fled from his brother.
Now Deborah, Rebekah's nurse, died, and she was buried below Bethel under the terebinth tree. So the name of it was called Allon Bachuth. Then God appeared to Jacob again when he came from Paddan Aram and blessed him. And God said to him, your name is Jacob. Your name shall not be called Jacob any more, but Israel shall be your name. So he called his name Israel. Also God said to him, I am God Almighty. Be fruitful and multiply. A nation and a company of nations shall proceed from you, and kings shall come from your body. The land which I gave Abraham and Isaac, I give to you, and to your descendants after you, I give this land. Then God went up from him in the place where he talked with him. So Jacob set up a pillar in the place where he talked with him, a pillar of stone, and he poured a drink offering on it, and he poured oil on it. And Jacob called the name of the place where God spoke with him, Bethel.
Bethel, house of God. So why would you not want to go back to God's house? Because the relationship started chapters ago, years ago.
Yeah.
And you have not lived up to your new name, Israel. Prince with God, or one who struggles with God. Yes, that part of it he seems to have been living up to. But you can see the struggle with faith, or of faith, with Jacob is he's up and down all the time. And this seems to be one of his high points, right?
Yeah. But certainly not a pure family, because he has to say to them, and he's aware of it, get rid of your foreign gods.
He knows they're there.
Yeah. And then he buries them or whatever, he hides them from them. But he's aware that this is a problem, and he's permitted it up till now. It's like this disaster maybe is the catalyst. Okay, we got to get serious now.
Yeah.
And so he tries to remove what's bad. He's also in fear, right, that they're going to come after him. But then there's divine protection.
So we have God speaking to him in verse 1. Then we have this terror, this supernatural terror from God that falls on all the cities round about, so they don't do what Jacob fears they will do. And then you have God appearing to Jacob again in verse 9. It's like he needs this transfusion of fresh assurance and faith to go forward.
Yeah.
Maybe it's also a hint that maybe the reason he held back all these years from going to Bethel is because he was conscious that they were not purified. They were not living up to their calling.
Mm-hmm.
And now he's at least making an effort to
Many
repent.
times you hear him talking about God having blessed him, God having been, responsible for the good that happened to Laban, the riches they gain.
Mm-hmm.
So he's aware of God's presence in his life, but he doesn't show absolute confidence in that, faith in that.
It doesn't do him a lot of good because he doesn't have a sense of God's presence. Here, obviously, he will. God appears to him. And what does God say? I am El Shaddai.
Yeah.
Notice the divine name is absent here. Actually, the divine name has been absent since chapter 33. And that might be indicative of the problem, namely that the divine name, as we've said before in the Genesis studies, is the Tetragrammaton itself is a guarantee of God's presence. He is the God who personally appears, has a personal relationship with his people, and therefore communicates directly with his people. These are two or three of the meanings of the word Yahweh in the Old Testament. So when that name disappears, as it has here for a few chapters, and will for a few chapters, right to the end of the book, really, the name, the covenant name is suppressed, especially when you have the story of Joseph and his family in Egypt. The name completely disappears.
Yeah.
And a lot of people have theories about why that is, 2 documents, etc. But the best reason within the context is there's no sense of God's presence anymore with them.
Yeah, and here he repeats the promise about the land. By the end of the chapter, when they're in Egypt, they're outside the land, and they must be aware of that.
The book, you mean? End of the book?
By the end of the book, what did I say?
End of the chapter?
Yeah, end of the book. Yeah, so they must, by the time they get to Egypt, they're outside of the promised land. They become slaves there. So you would think the name would diminish, because this is viewed as judgment from
That's
God.
right. And in those chapters too, in Egypt, there are no more personal appearances of God. He doesn't appear. Here it says even that when he'd finished appearing, God went up, Elohim went up from him.
Mm-hmm.
So these personal appearances, this seal of the personal relationship that exists between Israel and his God, ceases when they're in Egypt, although God continues to providentially take care of them. So Jacob on his deathbed is able to say, the God who has been with me all my life.
Yeah.
You can see it then
Yeah.
in what has happened over those decades.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So the idea that the name and the theophanies are connected in a way that we as witnesses never understood, and that would explain why the name disappears completely from the New Testament. God has ceased to communicate directly with even Christians after that period, apparently. But certainly the suppression of the name in Israel's history, right to today. So the Jews are superstitiously afraid of even using the name. Well, yeah, but there's precedent for that here.
As a witness, I never made the connection, though, of being outside their land and being in judgment, that their exiles were a judgment from God. And so there was shame attached to that. And even the prophets talk about them being responsible for profaning his name. Well, it's not that they were using it badly. It was because of their behavior. Being in covenant with him and then needing that kind of judgment brought shame with it on God. So they're conscious of that, and so they don't use the name. That makes perfect sense, whereas the thought had never even occurred to me as a witness.
No, why would it? It's not being brought to your attention. Here's Alfred Edersheim, of course, a very famous Jewish Christian on these events. But one, though undesigned, consequence of the crime, that is the crime at Shechem, proved a further blessing to Jacob. It was quite clear that he and his family must remove from the scene of Simeon's and Levi's treachery and cruelty. Then it was that God directed Jacob to return to Bethel and fulfill the promise which he had there made on fleeing from the face of Esau his brother, which includes the land promise. He needs to be reassured about that. About 10 years must have elapsed since the return of Jacob from Mesopotamia, and yet he had not paid his vows unto the Lord. From what follows, we infer that in all probability the reason of this delay had been that the family of Jacob had not been purged from idolatry, and that hitherto Jacob had been too weak to remove from his household what must have rendered his appearance at Bethel morally impossible.
And then we have Barnhouse saying, the love of God was calling Jacob back to himself. Through the waywardness of the past years, culminating in the massacre at Shechem, Jacob was pursued by this never-changing love. Their spiritual declination, how do you say that?
Or is it declension?
Declension. The years of wandering are permitted to wear down their resistance and to bring irresistible grace to triumph. It was 30 years since Jacob had vowed to return. He had been living in Shechem for 10 years, and Bethel was only 30 miles away. Chapter 34 does not mention God and is full of lust, murder, deceit, and wretchedness. But this chapter is filled with God. His name appears 10 times plus once as God Almighty, El Shaddai, plus 11 times in the names Bethel and Israel. The contrast is striking, as it always must be in the life of a believer living out the will of God, and again when he returns to the will of God. There was no change in relationship. Jacob was as much a child of God in Shechem as at Bethel, but fellowship was restored. Relationship can never be destroyed. Fellowship can.
Great point. Great contrast.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
But when he says the names of God, not at all in chapter 34, but all over the place in 35, that's true. But which name?
Yeah.
So it's El and Elohim, never the Tetragrammaton.
Yeah.
Which is of immense importance when you think about this point that he makes about relationship and fellowship.
So he's talking about designation of God. Is naming God, putting him in it.
So again, to underline the point, when he's talking about, he has a sense of broken fellowship with God. The whole family should have that, but Jacob seems to especially feel the sense of a broken fellowship. But the relationship has not been broken.
That's right. You know, you're always a child, even if you have a break or a fight with a parent, you're still always the child. But you can harm the relationship, cause a strain.
A rift in fellowship.
A rift, yeah. But it doesn't change the fact that you're the child.
So one of these things, that is fellowship, is greatly dependent upon how you feel. In other words, it has its basis in your emotions. But relationship doesn't have a basis in your emotions.
It's a fact.
It's reality.
Yeah, that's right. So we were going to link the Divine Names series, the first of 5 that you did, and the playlist of the Tetragrammaton.
Yeah, there's a few dozen videos in that one, I think.
Okay.
See you soon.